This is Donetsk, 2 years after the fall of Avdiivka. What Moscow once touted as an unstoppable offensive momentum has now become nothing more than a weary slog across scorched fields. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS in Washington, in many sectors Russian forces are advancing only a few dozen meters per day. A few dozen meters, in exchange for thousands of lives, armored convoys torn apart, and units disintegrating under drone barrages. This is not the image of a triumphant superpower on the path to victory. This is the image of a war machine running out of breath, falling apart, sliding deeper into the very attrition strategy it designed. And in the rear, instead of admitting failure, the Kremlin is preparing an even more brutal step. By the end of 2025, Russia completed the legal framework, allowing the mobilization of reserves in a rolling, incremental manner, tightening the electronic summons system and turning call-up orders into virtually inescapable sentences. Ban on leaving the country. Asset freezes, criminalization of evasion. According to the Institute for the Study of War, ISW Moscow has paved the way for the potential mobilization of up to roughly 2 million reservists. If the war continues to bog down, 2 million human beings are not a symbol of strength. That is a sign of desperation. This is not a declaration of immediate full mobilization, but the machinery has been assembled, the laws have been passed, the lists have been digitized. The question now is no longer whether Russia can mobilize. The question is, how deeply must a leader sink to be willing to put 2 million lives on the table just to conceal a failing war? Since 2023, Moscow has begun rolling out a nationwide electronic summons system, and by the 2024-25 period, the mechanism expanded at breakneck speed. Instead of police knocking on doors to deliver draft notices, summons can now be posted directly to the Gosuslugi Public Services portal. Under the new rules, the order takes effect the moment it appears in the system, regardless of whether the recipient reads it or not. That means didn't receive the paper or didn't know about it is no longer a valid excuse. The system automatically triggers restrictive measures against those summoned: immediate travel ban, freeze on registering new vehicles, restrictions on real estate transactions, difficulties in obtaining bank loans or credit. AP News and Meidzo have reported that this is one of the most aggressive steps to make draft evasion extremely risky and costly. Alongside the electronic system are amendments to the Russian criminal code. Penalties for evading military service have been stiffened, with the risk of lengthy prison terms. Not only can those summoned face prosecution for non-compliance, but individuals or organizations deemed to be assisting evasion can also face criminal charges. The Russian parliament, the State Duma, passed these bills under the slogans of protecting the motherland and combating distortion of history, expanding the scope of punishment for voices opposing the war. The overall picture shows a legal mechanism designed to eliminate loopholes where delay, negotiation, or simple avoidance once existed. To grasp the scale of the change, recall September 2022, when Vladimir Putin announced partial mobilization of about 300,000 reservists. Russia witnessed chaos at airports and border crossings. Long lines of people trying to leave the country. According to estimates from ISW and various Western research institutes, between 700,000 and 900,000 people may have left Russia in the months that followed. Though the exact figure remains disputed, the psychological impact was undeniable. A wave of unease spread through the middle class and young working population. The Kremlin learned its lesson from that shock. Sudden mass mobilization can trigger panic and expose the depth of societal discontent. So instead of repeating a jarring decision, Moscow shifted to a different strategy, building a legal foundation to call people up at any time in small, low-profile batches sufficient to sustain the flow of manpower to the front. That is the rolling model that Western analysts, including the Institute for the Study of War, have warned about. No need for a full-scale mobilization announcement. No need for dramatic speeches. Just acquire the operating system where every individual on the reserve list knows they are within the state's reach. When all these pieces are put together, the picture becomes clearer. The legal mechanism has been prepared. The digital tools are ready. Punishments have been strengthened. Large-scale mobilization no longer depends on fleeting political emotion, but on strategic decisions from the Kremlin. Those legal changes are a response to an increasingly undeniable battlefield reality. The attrition strategy Moscow is pursuing is hitting a harder wall than expected. The UK Ministry of Defence, in its periodic intelligence updates throughout 2024 and 2025, consistently estimated Russian casualties exceeding hundreds of thousands since the full-scale invasion began. CSIS analyses in 2025 went further, stating that Russia is suffering the highest losses of any major power since World War II, a far from light comparison in modern military history. Ukraine puts forward even higher figures. In some months late in 2025, Kyiv claimed Russia lost 30,000 to 35,000 soldiers per month. The West tends to be more cautious in its counts. But even the most conservative estimates acknowledge Russia's rate of attrition is extraordinarily high relative to the territorial gains achieved. And that is the key point. If a war machine accepts such a steep price, it should at least get breakthroughs in return. But according to CSIS analysis, on axes like Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar, Russia's average advance speed at times was measured in mere tens of meters per day. Weeks of fierce fighting, heavy shelling, destroyed armored vehicles, and the map barely changes. Russia currently controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory, but the bulk of that is Crimea and parts of Donbass, already held by Moscow since 2014-2015. What has been gained since 2022 has come at an enormous cost for tiny, pulverized patches of land. Meanwhile, Ukraine is not standing still. In 2025, Kyiv announced plans to produce millions of FPV drones annually, turning the battlefield sky into a 24/7 hunting network. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte has repeatedly warned that Russia is suffering heavy losses due to UAVs and real-time surveillance technology. Drones, ISR systems, Starlink for communications, and rocket artillery like HIMARS have completely transformed the operating environment. War is no longer about large formations advancing across open fields. It is a high-tech contest where a small, well-equipped group can paralyze a unit many times its size. It is here that the Kremlin's old assumptions began to falter. Putin once relied on simple logic. More people means more chances. Just keep pushing forces into the front line, and the enemy will eventually exhaust itself first. But in the era of drones and real-time reconnaissance, sheer numbers no longer automatically translate into advantage. Each mass assault can become a target for swarms of kamikaze UAVs. Each supply convoy can be spotted and destroyed before it deploys. When technology allows Ukraine to see and strike nearly every movement, the trademen for land strategy becomes so costly it borders on absurd, and that is why manpower has become an existential issue. If losses remain high, if advance rates fail to compensate, if volunteers no longer fill the gaps, pressure shifts to the reserve lists, not because it is the optimal choice but because other options are gradually running out. In a war where technology and adaptability determine outcomes, relying on raw numbers may only accelerate the attrition spiral. And as domestic manpower grows strained, Moscow has turned outward. Reports from 2025-2026 show a growing trend. Russia seeks to supplement forces with foreigners. Reuters, citing Ukrainian sources, reported that over 1,400 Africans have fought for Russia, a figure that may fluctuate but reflects the scale of the phenomenon. The Atlantic Council, drawing on Kyiv's statements, analyzed that Russia has recruited tens of thousands of foreigners from 128 countries and territories since the war began, alongside fighters from former Soviet areas. International media have mentioned citizens of India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Cuba, and some Middle Eastern countries. Many were initially promised civilian jobs or labor contracts only to end up on the Ukrainian front lines. Personal stories published by Western media paint a picture not of eager idealists, but of laborers seeking income in tough economic conditions and drawn into someone else's war. International reactions were inevitable. Kenya announced investigations into suspected recruitment brokers and shut down hundreds of facilities allegedly involved in disguised recruitment. India confirmed citizens killed in Ukraine and demanded explanations from Moscow about recruitment circumstances. Sri Lanka even sent a delegation to Moscow to request the return of those pulled into combat. These moves are not just diplomatic matters. They reflect the reality that Russia, rather than relying solely on the resources of a nation of over 140 million people, has had to seek soldiers from low-income regions with few economic options. For a nuclear superpower that once prided itself on military strength and geopolitical stature, having to rely on short-term contracts with foreign laborers to sustain a military campaign is a sobering sign. It shows that domestic volunteer pools have thinned significantly, or at least are insufficient to meet the demands of prolonged attrition. When signing bonuses must rise to attract locals and reserve lists remain the last resort, expanding recruitment abroad can be seen as an effort to plug gaps. But those gaps exist for a reason. The longer the war drags on, the higher the human cost, and the initial enthusiasm, if it ever existed, has given way to fatigue and doubt. In that context, Russia turning to poor laborers from Africa and South Asia, accepting diplomatic risks and international backlash, is not the image of a confident war machine. It looks more like a system straining to maintain pace, desperately trying to prolong an attrition strategy while internal resources are increasingly depleted. But the problem doesn't stop at the battlefield or recruiting more people from outside. The bigger question lies in the rear. How long can the Russian economy withstand if millions of people continue to be pulled out of the civilian sector? The International Monetary Fund, IMF, in its recent forecast shows Russia's growth for 2025-2026 at just below 1%, a modest figure for an economy bearing enormous war costs. BOFIT, the Bank of Finland Institute for Emerging Economies, warns that Russia's current growth relies heavily on defense spending in war-related industries, rather than long-term investment in civilian production or technological innovation. This creates a distorted growth model, where the state budget pumps money into the military to sustain operations, while other sectors face contraction pressure. At the same time, Russia's long-standing demographic weakness is becoming more acute. The SWP in Berlin notes that Russia's workforce is shrinking due to an aging population and persistently low birth rates since the 1990s. Many industrial and construction sectors were already short hundreds of thousands of workers even before the war began. When hundreds of thousands were mobilized in 2022 and a large number of citizens left the country, the pressure intensified. In that context, the scenario of mobilizing up to 2 million reservists is not just a military calculation, but an enormous labor shock. 2 million people leaving the civilian economy means 2 million vacant positions in factories, construction sites, hospitals, schools, and small businesses. To compensate, the government may have to raise defense sector wages and continue expanding military spending. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, estimates that Russia's defense spending in 2025 is already around 7% of GDP, a high ratio given the economy's weak growth. If troop numbers surge, the defense budget could swell even further, shifting the burden to other social sectors or forcing the government to accept higher deficits. This raises questions about long-term sustainability. An economy can tolerate high military spending for a short time, but as war drags on, dependence on defense expenditure can erode competitiveness and civilian investment capacity. The social impact cannot be ignored either. The 2022 mobilization wave triggered significant emigration. If this round is much larger, a new wave of exodus cannot be ruled out, even with tightened legal measures. Even if the number leaving doesn't reach 2022 levels, anxiety could spread among the middle class and professionals worried about career prospects and family stability. A predictable consequence is declining domestic consumption. When millions of families face the risk of losing their main breadwinner, spending becomes more cautious. Personal investment drops, and the domestic market comes under pressure. Loss of confidence is hard to measure statistically, but it may be the most corrosive factor when a country must constantly adjust laws to keep people in place and send them to the front. Questions about the level of social consensus will only grow. 2 million people on the reserve list are not just potential military manpower. They're part of the economy and social fabric. Pulling them out of civilian life means reallocating resources on a scale rarely seen in peacetime. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to receive financial and military support from the West, helping it sustain resistance without bearing the full cost alone. This contrast highlights Moscow's challenge, maintaining war while facing low economic growth, a shrinking workforce, and already high defense budgets. Mobilizing 2 million people may add numbers on paper, but the economic and social cost could far exceed short-term tactical gains. And in a prolonged conflict, an economy's endurance often determines more than troop tallies on a ledger. And as economic pressure mounts, another weakness in Russia's military structure is becoming clearer. Corruption and internal fractures. The Telegraph has published investigative reports showing some Russian commanders accused of taking bribes from soldiers in exchange for not being sent to the front line or being transferred to safer positions. The amounts can reach tens of thousands of dollars, an enormous sum for an ordinary soldier, in return for a chance to survive. The Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, has also analyzed that corruption in Russia's military system is not isolated but systemic, with personal connections and financial interests permeating from low to high levels. In such an environment, money is not just an incentive but the lubricant that keeps the machine running. This is especially critical when comparing the volunteer recruitment model with forced mobilization. In recent years, Russia has relied heavily on high salaries and contract bonuses to attract volunteers. For some, especially in low-income regions, that income is the real driver. But shifting to large-scale mobilization of reservists means these people are not joining for bonuses or personal choice. They are called up by obligation. The difference in motivation cannot be underestimated. A force driven by financial incentives can maintain a certain level of commitment. A force compelled by duty may obey orders, but but not necessarily carry high fighting spirit. When motivation drops, the risk to combat quality rises. Rush training, uneven equipment, and low morale can degrade the effectiveness of newly mobilized units. At the same time, if the budget comes under pressure from rising defense spending and slow economic growth, the ability to maintain large bonuses may be limited. When that happens, a system built on rewards and financial benefits risks fracturing. Commanders lose resources to distribute, soldiers lose material incentives, and trust in the system's fairness can erode. Military discipline relies not only on orders, but on belief that the system operates reasonably and rewards fairly. If that belief weakens, compliance may become superficial rather than genuine. In high-tech warfare, where coordination and rapid response determine survival, any fracture in the command structure can be amplified on the battlefield. Adding more people may increase numbers on paper. But if quality and cohesion decline, that advantage can quickly turn into a burden. And that is the paradox Moscow faces, trying to solve a manpower crisis by scaling up, while that very scaling deepens existing weaknesses in the military system. Meanwhile, Kyiv is playing a different game at a different pace. Ukraine lacks a population advantage and vast strategic depth, but it has built a different edge, technology, and adaptability. From 2024 to 2025, Kyiv announced plans to produce millions of domestic FPV drones per year, turning UAVs from a supporting weapon into the backbone of the battlefield. Small workshops, civilian tech companies, and volunteer groups have been integrated into a flexible defense innovation ecosystem, where improvements are deployed on weekly or even daily cycles rather than yearly ones. At the same time, Ukraine continues to receive substantial support from the US and the European Union, with military and financial aid packages worth tens of billions of dollars since the full-scale invasion began. HIMARS systems, precision-guided artillery shells, satellite networks, and real-time intelligence sharing have helped Ukraine offset some of the numerical disadvantage. In contrast, Russia appears stuck in a traditional attrition warfare model, where artillery volume and troop numbers are seen as the decisive keys. That approach once provided an advantage in early phases, but as the battlefield becomes saturated with sensors, drones, and high-precision weapons, throwing more people into the front line no longer guarantees proportional effectiveness. Relying on quantity over innovation forces Moscow to constantly compensate losses with raw numbers, while the opponent reduces losses through technology and flexible tactics. In that context, the prospect of mobilizing up to 2 million reservists may create an impression of scale, but it does not automatically change the core variables. 2 million people cannot reverse Russia's shrinking demographic trend. They cannot immediately upgrade technological capabilities or fix limitations in command and logistics systems. And most importantly, they do not change the reality that Ukraine has adapted to modern warfare far faster than many predicted. Putin can sign decrees, activate call-up systems, and add more names to lists, but he cannot mobilize eroded social trust, cannot will a slow-growth economy into strength, and cannot mobilize time to rewind missed opportunities. In a prolonged war where every passing month reshapes the technological and economic balance, time has become the most critical strategic factor. And at this point, with everything unfolding, time appears to be on Kyiv's side more than Moscow's. If you want to continue following the deepest and most up-to-date battlefield analyses, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next update.